Good evening.
As a middle-aged Generation X guy living in the 2020s, why am I so drawn to Alfred Hitchcock movies? Why do so many people still love and adore these films, even though the last Hitchcock movie was released almost 50 years ago? Before we get into those questions and more, my name is Eric Wilfred Watson. My thriller novels Judas Kissed and Becoming Quincy are available on Amazon.com. Your purchase of those books helps support this channel. As an independent author, I am grateful for every purchase and for everyone who reads my work. I've been a fan of the movies for as long as I can remember. When I was maybe 4 or 5 years old, I clearly remember my parents getting the first family VCR. It was an old silver thing, and the tape loaded from the top. We were not wealthy, so this was a luxury purchase for us. I still remember being blown away by the idea of being able to watch any movie whenever I wanted, as long as we had the tape. I loved going to the movies whenever possible, but I watched a lot more movies on VHS. I don't recall which Alfred Hitchcock movie I saw first, or how old I was exactly, or if it was my idea to watch the movie or my parents', but I fell in love with his style of suspense at a very, very young age. I also liked things that were more typical of a boy of about 10 years old. I was obsessed with Batman, for example, but for some reason I just fell in love with Hitchcock movies. I remember a friend of mine who was roughly the same age, maybe a grade younger. I made him watch Vertigo. That friend of mine was more interested in things like RoboCop and martial arts movies, but nevertheless I forced him to watch Vertigo. I felt duty-bound to expand his movie-watching tastes. He only watched the movie because I forced him to, but I enjoyed watching him watch the movie. It was sort of like a reaction video before reaction videos were a thing. I enjoyed watching somebody watch something I enjoyed watching. He found it suspenseful, and after Vertigo, we watched Psycho. One day, my poor dear mother came home from a hard day of work to find the bathroom floor flooded, her shower curtain ruined, and ketchup all over the walls. Me and that friend were trying to recreate the shower murder from the movie Psycho using a VHS camcorder. But that's enough about me. I love these old films, but what makes them so great? Number 1, he's the master of suspense. Hitchcock, at his best, is the master of making you desperate to know what happens next. Hitchcock was never a fan of mystery movies, or at least he never had any interest in making one. He described mysteries as an intellectual exercise, like a crossword puzzle. He wanted to create emotions, not intellectual puzzles, especially the emotions of suspense and fear. He gave us stories that were the opposite of mysteries. We knew what the stakes were, we knew the risks, we knew the danger, and we didn't know what would happen next. That doesn't mean there couldn't be surprises, plot twists, and the like, because there were. But Hitchcock let us know what the dangers were so that we could be afraid of them. A few examples would be the birds slowly accumulating behind a character in the playground. In North by Northwest, we got several establishing shots showing how isolated Cary Grant was. That was before the airplane attacked, so that you knew that he didn't have anywhere to go, so you were afraid for him. How could he possibly survive the situation? The danger of the priest in I Confess hangs over him the entire movie. We know who the villain is from the start. After the shocking murder in the movie Psycho, we knew that there was a danger at that motel, so we were in suspense and in fear for the people that came later. In the 1956 version of The Man Who Knew Too Much, we were told that there would be a murder when cymbals crashed during a classical music performance. The audience was on the edge of their seats during that musical performance, awaiting that exact moment. The tension was drawn out, and the suspense was felt by audiences. Hitchcock knew exactly how to give audiences the precise amount of information they needed so that they could experience the maximum level of suspense. Hitchcock knew that giving audiences information on what they should be worried about or afraid of would work in making them afraid of those things. Number 2, Hitchcock understood that people watch movies. Unlike books, which use prose to convey ideas, or plays, which rely heavily on dialogue, movies are all about looking at the movie on the screen. Alfred Hitchcock understood this when several other directors of his day just didn't. Now, that doesn't mean there weren't some fantastic movies in that era. Of course there were. But Hitchcock was a master at using the visual medium to portray stories, not just relying on the dialogue. When movies were a new thing, most actors were stage actors, and the narrative flow of a play was just shot with a camera as if it was just a stage production. Hitchcock, on the other hand, understood that movies were not plays. The camera was used to help tell the story. The camera would zoom in on a character's hand to convey plot points, emotions, or actions that the audience needed to see, that he didn't want the audience to miss. In Psycho, we enter a hotel room at the beginning of the movie via a slightly opened window, forcing the audience to participate in voyeurism. In the first half of the movie, the camera frequently focuses on the money, the $40,000 that she is stealing from her boss. The camera frequently focuses on the money, or the newspaper that the money is wrapped in, emphasizing its importance. Later, Norman Bates casually tosses it into the trunk of the car along with the dead body. It tells the audiences that whatever we thought was important, we had no idea what we were getting ourselves into. The newspaper with the money in it was the first thing the camera went to after the shower murder scene. Hitchcock employed camera angles to make us feel uneasy. When Norman Bates was being friendly with Marion Crane in the office, he was shot at an even angle. But when he became agitated, he was filmed from below to make him seem more threatening and ominous, and the birds around him helped add to that. In Franzy, there is a shot where the camera leaves the murder scene and goes outside where everything is normal, adding to the dread because no one outside knew of the horrors happening inside. Hitchcock knew exactly where he wanted to put the camera, and he was good at it. He popularized the dolly zoom, a camera effect where the camera would zoom in at the same time the camera was physically being pulled back, giving a surreal visual effect. This was most famously used in the movie Vertigo, but other directors have used it later. One famous example would be Steven Spielberg in the movie Jaws. Even today, a lot of movies forget this lesson. Modern movies focus a lot on quick cuts to make the action seem more exciting. Even when there isn't a lot of action, there's a lot of quick cuts and they don't really linger on objects. Rarely is the camera used as effectively as the way Hitchcock used it. Number 3. Alfred Hitchcock was not only the master of suspense, he was the master of the MacGuffin. The term MacGuffin is almost a derogatory term now for a cliched plot device, but it is still a very important movie storytelling tool. I've used it as an author. Most people who make movies have used it to one degree or another. It was Alfred Hitchcock that popularized the term when talking about his 1935 movie, The 39 Steps. In that movie, it was government secrets in a spy thriller. In other films, it was the money in Psycho, the ring in Shadow of a Doubt, the rope in the movie which was titled, appropriately enough, Rope, and so on. Number 4. The best movie monsters are human beings. Maybe it was Alfred Hitchcock's devout Roman Catholic upbringing and faith, but whatever the reason, he seemed to be acutely aware of the twisted, sinful nature that people had. He knew that people, even if they didn't want to admit it to themselves or other people, wanted to see sex, they wanted to see violence and death, they wanted to experience fear. Within the limits of what was allowed at the time, he gave that to his audiences. He manipulated them into wanting those things. We were made into voyeurs in Rear Window. We were there with the necktie killer in Franzy. We listened to the killer justify himself during the speech that Uncle Charlie gave in Shadow of a Doubt. Quentin Tarantino once said that he would have loved to see what Hitchcock would have done if he had become famous in America during the 70s rather than the 40s and 50s where movies were so restricted. I disagree. Hitchcock making movies for a more puritanical America allowed him to be more subtle with his presentation of those things. A good example of this would be the same-sex attraction undertones in the movie Rebecca. Mrs. Danvers talks at length about how she took great care of the now-deceased Rebecca. She even went so far as to show how see-through her lingerie was. In 1940, this was jaw-dropping stuff. Hitchcock was giving audiences exactly what he thought they didn't know they wanted to see. Hitchcock presented us things that showed the dark nature of humanity, especially with the act of murder. It wasn't about solving a murder mystery, who was the killer, who done it. Hitchcock usually wanted people to know who did it, so that we could be afraid. He wanted us to see the darker nature of people. We were in suspense because it was all about what the people were going to do next. We didn't know, because people can do anything. Sometimes people will do good, and quite often, people will act quite wickedly. Number 5. The music. While Alfred Hitchcock was not a musician that I know of, he effectively used music in his movies. The most obvious example is the movie Psycho. It's debatable if Psycho is really a horror movie because there is nothing supernatural about the movie, but it was a pivotal moment in the horror movie genre. Horror movies before Psycho were scored using bombastic orchestral music. The Dracula movie from the 1930s is a perfect example. It uses a lot of brass to create a spooky sound, to be sure, but Bernard Herrmann's score in Psycho took a different direction. In the same way that Psycho's movie monster was a human being, the music was much more down to earth and personal. It was designed to strike fear on a much more visceral level than in Dracula, which just created a spooky ambiance. Bernard Herrmann only used stringed instruments, which could be quite beautiful, but also quite visceral. The famous hee shrieking violins in the shower scene changed forever how horror movies would be scored. Number 6. Each film he made was a unique treasure. Alfred Hitchcock rarely repeated himself. He didn't make any sequels, and he tried to find movies that were not like his previous movie. One exception would be the remake of The Man Who Knew Too Much. But even there, the remake was quite different than the original. As a prolific director, Alfred Hitchcock made more than 60 movies. That's plenty of films to watch, to compare and contrast with one another, and for us to enjoy. Let me know in the comments, what do you think? Does Alfred Hitchcock deserve the acclaim he has today? What's your favorite Hitchcock movie or favorite Hitchcock moment?